everyone. Welcome to this special edition co-production of WION and A Voice of America. I'm Susan Tehrani, coming live to you from New York City. Let's get you started off straight with our first story, where a bipartisan deal could free $106 billion in foreign aid spending for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. It could also tighten immigration rules that the White House worked on for months that may be torpedoed by a former President Donald Trump if he is elected. White House Bureau Chief of VOA, Patsy Widakuswara, has this report.
Backed by voters who consider immigration the most important issue in the 2024 race, former President and likely Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump won the New Hampshire primary Tuesday.
We have millions and millions of people flowing into our country illegally. They come from prisons and they come from mental institutions.
The victory is likely to embolden Trump to pressure Republican lawmakers to avoid a compromise on an immigration deal. He said on social media last week that Republicans should not agree to a border deal unless they get everything needed to shut down what he called an invasion by millions of people. The White House and senators from both parties have worked for months to hash out a deal that would provide $106 billion in security aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Republicans insist that it include funding to secure the border and a tightening of immigration rules. Last week, President Joe Biden said he was hopeful the package would pass at least the Senate.
Now the question is for the Speaker and the House Republicans. Are they ready to act as well?
Immigration activists are pessimistic.
Congressional Republicans are not willing to put good faith policies on the table that bring into place a humane and orderly processing at the border and maintain asylum. Instead, we're seeing far-right Republicans dominate the debate, including former President Trump.
The border issue fires up the Republican base, and passing a bill that Democrats can claim as a win could hurt Republican messaging in an election year.
They don't want to do anything that might benefit Joe Biden and take this issue of the border off the table for the 2024 campaign.
As wars in Gaza and Ukraine continue to rage, foreign policy has become more of a concern among Americans this year. An AP North Center poll found 60% of Americans say foreign policy should be a top focus for 2024, up from 41% last year. 35% cite immigration as a top concern, an increase from 27%. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Washington.
Voice of America's Jessica Stone is joining us live now from the White House. Hi, Jessica. Well, let's talk about the primaries a little bit. Donald Trump is already campaigning like he's only got one opponent, and that being President Biden. But the Republican primary process is not finished yet. Ambassador of the UN, the former ambassador, Nikki Haley, is still in the race. She says she wants to campaign in her home state of South Carolina. Can you talk about the latest on the Republican race and this somewhat risky decision by Nikki Haley?
Yeah, so she's already in her home state of South Carolina, where she was governor for 6 years. She's doing that ahead of the February 24th primary there for Republicans, but she's running 30 points behind former President Donald Trump, and top Republican Party leaders are asking her to leave the race, arguing that she is dividing the party rather than unifying them around the leading candidate, that being Donald Trump. But she says, look, I'm not a quitter, and voters, they still do want a choice. And actually, the polling, especially the exit polling from the last two primary elections, does give us reason to believe that. For example, Trump showing some weakness in undeclared voters in particular, 64% of whom went after Haley. That's a code in New Hampshire for independent voters, and they're a large constituency up for grabs in the general election in November. And in an NBC Iowa poll before the caucus, 43% of Haley supporters would back Biden in a general election. So that's a weakness for Donald Trump as well. 50% of Iowa Republicans say they do not want to be part of the Make America Great Again movement, and 63% of New Hampshire Republicans said the same. Trump, meantime, facing more court appearances this week, actually testifying yesterday on the stand. That, too, could bring more evidence as these court cases progress that would further bring him down. But, of course, on the other hand, he's been in the news a lot lately. Not all good news for all of these criminal and civil court cases. and his poll numbers are soaring. Susan?
Yeah, Jessica, let's talk about Joe Biden as well. He has this balancing act of staying president and then also campaigning as well, becoming candidate Joe Biden. He hit the campaign trail again this week. How does his team view this race?
Well, they are already moving on to the general election, assuming that they are going to be running against former President Donald Trump. In fact, 2 White House staffers this week moving to the campaign, another indication of where their head is at. And the White House argument is this: Trump won New Hampshire by double digits, and the Biden team is really campaigning in 3 or 4 areas. They're campaigning on his economic record, which is risky because the polling is not good for him on the economy. Policies for reproductive rights, healthcare, and safekeeping of democracy. They argue that President Trump would not be a good safeguarder of democracy given what happened on January 6th. So Biden surrogates are already out on the airwaves making the case. They're saying that Trump takes an extreme position on abortion rights. President Biden in Manassas, Virginia earlier this week talking about abortion rights, but he is vulnerable, as Patsy Widukuswara said, on foreign policy. More people paying attention to foreign policy given the conflicts in Gaza, Ukraine, and the potential for conflict in Taiwan. And he was shouted down more than 12 times, I should say, at that event over the issue of the Gaza war, people calling for a ceasefire there. So he will have some vulnerability on that side of his campaign that he has to answer for. Back to you.
Okay, we'll be talking about foreign policy in just a little bit, and I'd love for you to stay with us to weigh in our next story as well, as there are growing concerns that the U.S. may soon be entangled in 2 wars, war in the Middle East as it supports Israel in its fight against Hamas, and another in Europe as it supports Ukraine as it fights off the Russian forces. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb has details.
Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole!
From Iraq to Yemen, U.S. forces, sometimes aided by British forces, are striking back against Iranian-backed groups. The Houthis have launched more than 30 attacks on international vessels in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden in what they say is a response to the war against Hamas in Gaza, although many of their attacks have targeted ships not associated with Israel. The strikes in Yemen this week hitting weapons facilities, radar sites, and missiles the U.S. said were ready to launch at international vessels.
Our goal here is to ensure that the Red Sea is safe and secure for international shipping and mariners. That is our only goal.
The international community is calling for an immediate end to the violence.
I urge all parties to step back from the brink and to consider the horrendous human costs of a regional conflict.
The White House says regional conflict is exactly what the U.S., Britain, and other allies are trying to avoid by conducting these strikes.
If you're going to scrap with somebody and you can find a way to tie one or both of their hands behind their back, that's not de-escalating, or that's not escalating, that's de-escalating. That's taking ability away from the other party to inflict harm.
Full points for not wanting a regional war and trying to avoid a regional war, but newsflash, we appear to have one.
Brad Bowman of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies says the U.S. isn't hitting Iranian proxies hard enough in the Middle East.
They are repeatedly trying to kill Americans. And the only reason why we haven't had more American casualties are because we've taken measures to defend ourselves and we've gotten lucky.
And he says the United States' lackluster response is not holding to account the ultimate aggressor, Iran.
And the more we talk about the Houthis or Hamas or Hezbollah, the more we play right into Iran's grand strategy, where they're the puppet master. They attack us via their puppets. They conceal their actions via their puppets. And then when we counterpunch, we hit the puppet and not the puppet master.
Tensions rise as Congress has stalled additional U.S. funding for Israel Defense Forces, as well as Ukraine, whose forces have fought a nearly 2-year war against Russian invaders.
Ukraine is not alone.
while recovering from a hospitalization earlier this month. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin hosted dozens of nations Tuesday in the first Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting since the Pentagon ran out of congressional-approved funds to send to Kyiv. The group aims to continue coordinated military support.
Can Ukraine win this war?
Ukraine will win this war, but not only Ukraine, but the whole democratic world.
The U.S. is still training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s in the western state of Arizona in hopes the additional capability will give Ukraine an advantage as it fights for survival. Carla Babb, VOA News, the Pentagon.
VOA's Jessica Stone is still live with us from the White House. Jessica, this week, Iran's foreign minister gave an interview in which he said that Washington is responsible for the rise in the risk of war in the Middle East. Has Washington responded?
Not directly, but Iran's foreign minister actually said in that interview that if the U.S. would stop arming Israel, the war would be over because Israel would be unable to fight. But the U.S. does remain committed, they say that routinely, to helping Israel defend itself, and maintains it can influence Prime Minister Netanyahu's prosecution of the war in Gaza. U.S. and Israel are not on the same page regarding what happens in Gaza after the war is over, though. The Israelis, and particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, wants to maintain control of the Gaza Strip. The Americans, they want to reform the Palestinian Authority and hand it over to them. And this week we saw 49 out of 51 Democrats in the Senate, the president's party, which they made clear because they passed a resolution that they support a future in which Palestinians and Israelis live side by side.
And you know, this increase in conflict in the Middle East, of course, is impacting consumers around the world as well, who receive products shipped through the Red Sea. Cargo ships continue to be attacked by these Houthi rebel forces that the Biden administration once again recently relisted as a terrorist organization. The UK and the US are responding. Are the Houthis getting the message?
Doesn't look like so far. The U.S. and the U.K. now also doubling down on sanctions. They imposed sanctions on 4 senior Houthi rebel leaders, saying they are the ones responsible for the attack, specifically on those cargo ships in the Red Sea. Iran does back the Houthis, but here's the deal. Freight costs are soaring around the world. I don't know if you've noticed when you go to the store, but goods are going up, not just because of inflation, but this is part of the inflationary pressure on prices. Freight costs have soared as major shipping firms are avoiding the Red Sea and taking that longer trip around the southern Horn of Africa. Bloomberg tracking showing that shipping costs have more than tripled since December. So expect to see that when you try to make a purchase. Susan?
All right, great. Jessica Stone joining us live from the White House in Washington, D.C. this morning. Jessica, thank you for everything and have a great weekend.